October 14, 1939. Evening. The Kremlin, Moscow. A Finnish delegation of 3 men is shown into a conference room on the 2nd floor of the Soviet government complex, a room that is kept several degrees warmer than necessary, with ceilings high enough to make the men sitting beneath them feel the appropriate size. At the table across from them sits Vyacheslav Molotov, People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, flanked by 2 aides who do not speak and do not need to. The lead Finnish negotiator is 69 years old, broad-shouldered, white-haired. His name is Juho Kusti Paasikivi. He is a banker and conservative politician, sent to Moscow because he is the Finnish official most likely to understand what Molotov is about to place on the table, and least likely to say something irretrievable in response. He has been to this city before. He was part of the delegation that negotiated Finnish independence with Soviet Russia in 1920. He knows the architecture of these rooms, the warmth, the scale, the silence, and what it is designed to produce. Molotov opens a folder. He slides a document across the table. Paasikivi reads it without changing his expression. The room is quiet. Outside, it is already dark. Molotov places a document on the table. It is a list of demands. Paasikivi reads it. He reads it again. The room is warm and quiet, and the clock on the wall measures out the silence while Paasikivi absorbs what the document means. The Soviets want the Hanko Peninsula at the southwestern tip of Finland leased for 30 years as a naval base. Soviet troops stationed 60 miles from Helsinki. They want a strip of the Karelian Isthmus, the land between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga, ceded to the Soviet Union. Territory that would require Finland to abandon the Mannerheim line, the only serious fortification standing between Soviet forces and the Finnish interior. They want several islands in the Gulf of Finland. They want a piece of the Rybaki Peninsula in the Arctic North. In exchange, they are offering Finland a larger stretch of Soviet Karelia to the north, wilderness, forest, nothing of strategic or economic value, and the assurance that the Soviet Union regards Finnish independence as a settled matter. Paasikivi is not a naive man. He has been watching Soviet foreign policy since the revolution. He understands with a clarity that many of his colleagues in Helsinki do not share, that the Soviet Union does not make requests of this kind from a position of benign concern. He understands that the demands, if accepted, will not end the pressure. They will establish the pattern. A nation that concedes the Hanko Peninsula and the Karelian Isthmus has demonstrated that concession is possible, and from that demonstration, further demands follow as surely as night follows the Finnish afternoon in November. He thanks Molotov. He says he will return to Helsinki and consult with his government. He folds his copy of the document and places it in his case. He stands. He shakes hands. He leaves. He does not tell Molotov what he already knows, that Finland is going to refuse, and he does not tell him what he also knows, with the quiet certainty of a man who has studied history carefully. That refusal means war, and that war means Finland will be fighting the largest army on earth in the dark and the cold with 300,000 men, most of them farmers. What Paasikivi does not know, what no one in that room knows, including Molotov, is that in 105 days it will be the Soviet Union asking Finland for terms. This is the story of how that happened. The context that produces the demands Paasikivi carries back to Helsinki in October 1939 is not complicated, but it is layered with the specific texture of Soviet strategic anxiety, which is a different thing from ordinary anxiety and expresses itself differently. The Soviet city of Leningrad, St. Petersburg until 1914, Petrograd until 1924, and now Leningrad sits 32 kilometers from the Finnish border. 32 kilometers. On a clear day, from an elevated position near the border, the city is visible. Soviet military planners have been noting this proximity in their strategic assessments since the 1920s, with the consistent conclusion that it represents an unacceptable vulnerability. a hostile power in control of Finnish territory. And Finnish territory in 1939 is not controlled by a hostile power, Finland being scrupulously neutral. Could shell Leningrad from Finnish soil. It could stage an invasion from Finnish territory that would reach the city in hours. It could use the Gulf of Finland to threaten Soviet naval access to the Baltic. The fact that Finland is not hostile and has no intention of becoming so does not resolve this anxiety, because the Soviet strategic imagination does not reason from Finland's current intentions. It reasons from the physical geography, which will remain long after current intentions have changed. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939 between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, has given Stalin the diplomatic cover he needs to act on this anxiety. The pact's secret protocols divide Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Finland falls in the Soviet sphere. Stalin does not intend to annex Finland, or so his diplomats maintain, but he intends to solve the geographic problem that Finland's independence creates by establishing Soviet bases on Finnish soil and Soviet control of the territory that could be used as an approach route to Leningrad. He presents this as a security proposal. The Finns present it to themselves as what it is, the preliminary step to a subordination that will leave Finland's independence as a legal formality without strategic substance. The Finnish government debates through October and into early November. Paasikivi argues for significant concessions short of the most strategically damaging demands. He is not alone in this view. There are Finnish politicians who believe the Soviet demands, while unacceptable in their totality, can be negotiated downward, and that some accommodation is preferable to the war that refusal will bring. They are not wrong about the war. They are calculating the cost of war against the cost of accommodation and reaching a different conclusion than those who believe accommodation itself is a path to eventual absorption. The Finnish government ultimately decides that the most damaging demands, the Hanko lease, the cession of the Karelian Isthmus territory behind the Mannerheim line, cannot be accepted, and that accepting them would leave Finland less defensible, not more secure. Negotiations continue through early November. They produce nothing. On November 26th, Soviet artillery fires several shells into the Soviet village of Manila, near the Finnish border. Soviet spokesmen blame Finland. Finnish military intelligence establishes within hours that the shelling is a fabrication. Soviet guns fired by Soviet order onto Soviet territory to provide a pretext that has been prepared in advance. No one in the international community who is paying attention believes the Manila incident. No one in a position of power does anything about their disbelief. On November 30th, 1939, 450,000 Soviet soldiers cross the Finnish border. The operational plan that Soviet commanders carry into Finland in November 1939 is a document that reflects, more than anything else, an institution's relationship with its political masters. The plan calls for simultaneous advances along the entire 1,340-kilometer border from the Gulf of Finland to the Arctic Ocean. The main effort runs through the Karelian Isthmus, the narrow land bridge between the Gulf and Lake Ladoga, toward the Finnish city of Viipuri and then Helsinki beyond it. Secondary advances drive across the waste of Finland, intended to cut the country in half and prevent Finnish forces in the south from receiving reinforcement from the north. Further advances seize the Arctic port of Petsamo and the nickel mines near Salla. The timeline for the main objectives is 12 days. Finnish capitulation is expected by Christmas. The plan is not based on an honest assessment of Finnish military capability or Finnish terrain. It is based on what the political leadership has decided to believe, and what the political leadership has decided to believe has been shaped by the fact that the political leadership executes officers who tell it things it does not want to hear. The Red Army arriving in Finland in November 1939 is the largest land military force on the face of the earth. It has approximately 6,000 tanks in the forces committed to the Finnish campaign against Finland's 30, most of them obsolete. It has 3,800 aircraft against Finland's approximately 130 of mixed condition. It has artillery in densities that smaller European nations cannot approach. It has a doctrine: deep battle. The theory of simultaneous strikes at every level of an enemy's operational structure that the most innovative military thinkers of the 1930s developed with genuine brilliance. It has all of this, and it has, in its senior leadership, the specific product of 2 years of political terror that makes all of the rest of it almost irrelevant. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin's purges removed approximately 35,000 officers from the Red Army. 3 of 5 marshals were shot. 13 of 15 army commanders were arrested, most of them killed. 50 of 57 corps commanders were purged. 154 of 186 divisional commanders disappeared. The men who replaced them were not the second tier of Soviet military talent. They were the men who had survived the purges by not being noticed, by saying yes, by reporting what their superiors wanted to hear, by keeping their heads below the line of fire in an institution where independent judgment was the most dangerous quality an officer could demonstrate. The Red Army that crosses into Finland in November 1939 is a body from which the central nervous system has been surgically removed and replaced with a system of reflexes trained exclusively in the direction of telling the political leadership what it wishes to hear. There is one man standing against this across the Finnish border who understands exactly what he is facing, has been preparing for it for more than a decade, and has structured Finland's defense around a single proposition: that the Red Army can be hurt badly enough, for long enough, that the Soviet Union will eventually prefer a negotiated solution to the continued cost of conquest. His name is Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, Field Marshal, Commander-in-Chief of the Finnish Defense Forces, born in 1867 to a Swedish-speaking Finnish noble family, former general of the Russian Imperial Army, who served with distinction through the First World War and then led the White Forces to victory in the Finnish Civil War of 1918. He is 72 years old in November 1939. He is tall, precise, aristocratic in his bearing, a man who chooses his words with the care of someone who has learned that words, once spoken in the wrong context, cannot be unsaid. He does not share the optimism of those Finnish politicians who believe the Soviet demands can be managed, or that the international community will intervene to save Finland before it is destroyed. He believes Finland is going to be invaded, has believed it for years, and has spent those years building a defensive system on the Karelian Isthmus and training a reserve force that, when mobilized, will be the most terrain-adapted fighting force on the Finnish front, because it will be composed almost entirely of men who grew up in the terrain they are now defending. Mannerheim's strategic concept for the Winter War is not a plan to defeat the Soviet Union. He is not confused about the mathematics of the confrontation. He is planning to make the Soviet Union pay a price so high over a period long enough that the political calculus in Moscow shifts from conquest to negotiation. He needs the Mannerheim line to hold on the isthmus long enough to bleed the initial assault. He needs the Finnish army in central and northern Finland to prevent Soviet forces from cutting the country in half and reaching the Gulf of Bothnia on the west coast. He needs the world to watch, to see clearly a small democratic nation fighting for its existence against a totalitarian superpower. Because the watching world is the only thing that might eventually produce the diplomatic or material support that Finland cannot generate internally. He is a cold and clear-eyed man, and what he is cold and clear-eyed about is that Finland can survive this war only if Finland fights it correctly for exactly as long as it has the capacity to fight, and accepts whatever terms can be extracted from Moscow before the moment when the capacity to fight is exhausted. He cannot afford sentiment. He cannot afford to confuse fighting well with winning. They are not the same thing, and understanding the difference between them is the condition of Finnish survival. The Finnish army that mobilizes in October and November 1939 is not the army that a military observer expecting a conventional force would recognize. Finland's standing army at the outbreak of the war numbers approximately 33,000 men. 33,000 against the 600,000 the Soviet Union will eventually commit. Its reserve mobilization brings the total to approximately 300,000, organized in 9 divisions with supporting units. This is the force that Soviet generals, briefed on Finnish military strength before the invasion, are reported to have laughed at, not metaphorically, not rhetorically, but actually laughed at in conference rooms in Moscow, as an expression of genuine contempt for the idea that 300,000 Finns with 30 obsolete tanks and a few hundred aging aircraft constitute a military problem for the largest army on Earth. The laughter is the single most consequential mistake of the entire Winter War. It is the sound of an institution that has confused the size of an army with its effectiveness, and the number of tanks with the capacity to use them, and the total of columns on a logistics spreadsheet with actual fighting power in a specific terrain in a specific season. The Finnish army is not an army of 300,000 men in the conventional sense. It is an army of 300,000 men who have grown up in the landscape they are now defending. Its soldiers are farmers from the Karelian farmlands in the south, hunters and lumberjacks from the forests of central Finland, fishermen from the lake districts, reindeer herders from Lapland. They have, virtually all of them, been members of the Suojeluskunta, the civil guard, the voluntary defense organization that has trained in Finnish forests and drilled on Finnish terrain since independence in 1917. They ski. They navigate by landmarks and stars in forests where a man who does not know the landscape is blind. They understand cold not as a threat to be managed, but as a constant of their environment, to be dressed for and worked in and fought in with the same practical indifference that a shipwright has to water. They have, most of them, been hunting with rifles since childhood in terrain where a missed shot meant a meal that did not happen, and the discipline that produces has been building in their hands and eyes for 20 years. When these men put on uniforms in November 1939 and move to their assigned defensive positions, they are not becoming soldiers. They are becoming soldiers in addition to everything they already are. The Finnish army is the only army in the Winter War that is fighting on ground it knows. And that difference, that single asymmetry in a confrontation where everything else favors the Soviet Union, is enough. The invasion is everywhere simultaneously on November 30th. 4 Soviet armies advance along 4 primary axes. On the Karelian Isthmus, the 7th Army drives toward Viipuri. North of Lake Ladoga, the 8th Army advances through the forests toward the lakeshore. In central Finland, the 9th Army pushes toward the Gulf of Bothnia. In the far north, the 14th Army seizes the Arctic port of Petsamo and begins moving toward the nickel mines at Salla. The advances are designed to be simultaneous and overwhelming, a pressure so distributed that Finnish forces cannot concentrate and cannot respond to everything at once. The theory is sound. It fails almost immediately in practice. The 7th Army on the Karelian Isthmus reaches the Mannerheim line and stops. Not within days. Within the first week. The line is not the impregnable concrete fortress it will be described as in some later accounts. Its bunkers are relatively modest by European standards. Its defensive depth is limited, and Finnish planners have known since the construction began that it will not hold indefinitely against a fully committed Soviet assault. What it does is channel Soviet advances into killing grounds that Finnish defenders have spent years preparing. Anti-tank obstacles, granite boulders and concrete dragon's teeth funnel Soviet armor into narrow corridors where Finnish anti-tank teams wait. Finnish soldiers in the bunkers and field positions behind the line do not hold their positions because they have been ordered to. They hold because they understand what the Mannerheim line means. It is the last prepared defensive position between the Soviet army and the Finnish heartland. Behind it is Finland. There is nothing else. The tanks that should be the decisive element of Soviet combat power on the isthmus are destroyed one by methods that Soviet military doctrine has no prepared response for. Finnish soldiers approach frozen Soviet tanks from angles the turrets cannot traverse and jam metal bars into their track links and then disappear back into the snow. They throw improvised petrol bombs, gasoline in glass bottles with burning wicks, onto the engine decks of vehicles that have separated from their infantry, and they name the weapon with a dark national wit, the Molotov cocktail, for the foreign minister who publicly claims that Soviet aircraft bombing Finnish cities are dropping bread to the hungry, not bombs. If Soviet aircraft are delivering bread, Finnish soldiers reason, then Finnish firebombs are cocktails to wash it down. The Soviets are not amused. The Soviets are also not advancing. North of Lake Ladoga, the situation is worse. The 8th Army's divisions enter the forest on the only routes available, narrow logging tracks through boreal wilderness. And Finnish commanders apply a tactic that has been developed specifically for this terrain and this enemy. The Finns call it moti, the Finnish unit for a cubic meter of firewood. The principle is simple and lethal. Finnish ski troops allow Soviet columns to extend themselves along forest roads, moving deeper into Finnish territory, stretching their supply lines, losing cohesion. Then, Finnish soldiers fell trees simultaneously across the road at multiple points, front and rear, sealing sections of the column in place. Finnish forces then eliminate each sealed section methodically, attacking from the forest on both flanks, withdrawing before Soviet counterattacks, reappearing from different directions, maintaining pressure from positions that cannot be fixed or suppressed because the forest conceals them absolutely. The column cannot advance, it cannot retreat, it cannot be supplied. It can only sit in the road in -30 degrees Celsius until it dies. The forest is patient. The forest does not need artillery or tanks or air support. It only needs the Finns to know it, and the Finns know it the way they know their own houses. 2 Soviet divisions, the 18th and the 168th, are encircled north of Lake Ladoga and destroyed over a period of weeks. The 18th Division, by historians' estimates, loses approximately 15,000 of its 17,000 men. The men do not die primarily in battle. They die of cold in the positions they occupied when the temperature dropped below what their equipment and their bodies can sustain. Soviet dead are found frozen in the postures of men who simply stopped, sitting against trees, lying across their weapons, gathered in circles around fires that went out. They are wearing greatcoats designed for -15 degrees Celsius. The temperature is -40. In central Finland, at a small town called Suomussalmi, surrounded by lakes and forest 800 kilometers north of Helsinki, the catastrophe that will define the international perception of the Winter War unfolds through December 1939 and into January 1940. 2 Soviet divisions, the 163rd and the 44th, are assigned the task of capturing Suomussalmi and driving west to the Gulf of Bothnia, cutting Finland in half. Finnish Colonel Jalmar Siilasvuo has 11,000 men to stop them. The Soviets have 45,000. Siilasvuo applies the moti at full divisional scale. He allows the 163rd to enter Suomussalmi, surrounds it with Finnish ski troops, and cuts its supply line. He then turns east to meet the 44th Division, which has come to relieve the 163rd, and cuts the 44th into separate encirclements along 40 kilometers of forest road. By early January 1940, approximately 27,000 Soviet soldiers are surrounded in the Suomussalmi wilderness with food for 4 days and no prospect of relief. The temperature is -40. Finnish losses at Suomussalmi when the battle is over: 750 killed, 1,300 wounded. Soviet losses: approximately 17,000 killed at minimum, thousands more captured or dead of cold in the forest. The divisional commander of the 44th, Alexei Vinogradov, is court-martialed by order of the 9th Army and shot in front of his surviving troops. The Red Army's answer to failure is not analysis. It is a bullet and a lesson for the survivors. The next commander who allows this to happen will receive the same treatment. The lesson this produces is not improvement. It is silence. Soviet officers across the front begin reporting that operations are proceeding according to plan, because reporting that operations are not proceeding according to plan is a path to the firing squad. The reports that reach Moscow in December 1939 from all four army fronts are a masterpiece of institutional self-deception. They describe progress where there is stagnation. They describe enemy forces being fixed and suppressed, where those same enemy forces are skiing invisibly through forests and cutting Soviet columns into frozen sections. They use the precise military language of a professional officer corps to describe a reality that does not exist, because the reality that does exist, an invasion collapsing on virtually every axis in the first 30 days, is not something that can be reported to Stalin and survived. General Kirill Meretskov, commanding the Leningrad military district and responsible for the initial operational failure, sends dispatches to Moscow that describe the situation as developing according to the broader strategic intent. It is, by any honest accounting, the most expensive institutional lie in the history of Soviet military communications. The world is watching. Military attachés from Germany, Britain, France, the United States and Japan are observing, reporting and drawing conclusions. The newspapers of neutral nations carry photographs and front-page dispatches from the Finnish front that make the same argument in their different ways. The largest army on earth cannot defeat a nation of farmers in 2 weeks, or 3, or 6. The League of Nations, in what will prove to be one of its final acts of institutional significance, expels the Soviet Union from membership on December 14, 1939, the only time in the League's history that a permanent member is removed. The expulsion is symbolically significant and practically meaningless. No Allied force is coming to Finland's aid. Britain and France discuss it. They make promises. The promises arrive slowly, in quantities that are always less than what was promised, and they must pass through Norway and Sweden, both of which are neutral and have no intention of allowing the transit of Allied troops across their territory in a war that might become their own war if they misstep. Finland has always known this. Mannerheim has planned accordingly. Finland is alone, and Finland will remain alone. And the question that Mannerheim has been asking since October 1939 is not how to be saved, but how to survive long enough to negotiate. Adolf Hitler is watching from Berlin with the specific attention of a man looking for confirmation of a conclusion he has already reached. The Winter War's evidence, as it accumulates through December 1939 and January 1940, is the best argument yet for the conclusion he has been developing since the purges of 1937, that the Red Army is a hollow institution, enormous in mass, negligible in professional capacity, its best officers killed by its own political leadership, its chain of command a machine for transforming reality into acceptable fiction before delivering it to Stalin. Hitler studies the reports. He studies the photographs of the Rate Road, the supply route to the encircled divisions at Suomussalmi, where Finnish forces have destroyed a column of vehicles, men, artillery and horses that stretches 30 kilometers through the forest, its remnants frozen solid by January 1940, a visible monument to the distance between Soviet military ambition and Soviet military capability. He draws the conclusion that will shape the next 3 years of the war. The Soviet Union can be defeated in a single campaign before it recovers from what Stalin has done to its officer corps. This conclusion is wrong. It is wrong in the most consequential possible way, because the Red Army is already beginning to learn, and what it is learning in the Finnish forests will make it a more dangerous opponent than it has ever been. But in January 1940, the evidence that supports Hitler's conclusion is genuine, and the error is not obvious from Berlin. Stalin in Moscow is not watching the Winter War from the distance that Hitler is. He is in it, and it is not going the way he was told it would go. The generals who told him 12 days have not been proven right. The Christmas capitulation that his operational plan promised has not arrived. What has arrived is a series of reports, increasingly frantic beneath their official language, increasingly difficult to square with the maps, describing a Red Army that has been stopped on every axis, is losing divisions to Finnish encirclement in the forests, and cannot break through a defensive line that was built by a small nation with limited industrial capacity in the preceding 15 years. Stalin's response has two phases. The first phase is the one his system always produces. He removes the commanders who have failed and threatens the ones who remain. Meretskov is removed. Lesser commanders are shot or imprisoned. The message is clear. The second phase is the one that will eventually determine the war's outcome. He gives the problem to Semyon Timoshenko. Timoshenko is appointed commander of the Northwestern Front on January 7, 1940. He is 44 years old, heavy-set, deliberate, and the product of a military career that has taught him, through the specific education of Stalin's Soviet Union, to distinguish between what can be accomplished and what the political leadership needs to believe can be accomplished, and to produce the former while managing the latter. He does not try to replicate Finnish tactics or match Finnish skill in forest warfare. He does not look for the clever solution. He has 6,000 guns, virtually unlimited ammunition, and a directive from Moscow that says Finland must be defeated. He prepares to use all three. Through January and into early February, Timoshenko rebuilds the Soviet assault force on the Karelian Isthmus. He concentrates heavy artillery at densities the Mannerheim line was not designed to absorb. He reorganizes the supply system so that ammunition arrives in the volumes his plan requires. He retrains infantry units in the specific technique of following an artillery barrage closely, moving forward within meters of exploding shells, accepting the casualties from their own fire rather than losing the window of suppression the barrage creates. He establishes communications discipline. He imposes an operational culture of documented preparation before action rather than improvised advance. He is not doing anything inventive. He is doing the fundamental things that the initial Soviet assault entirely failed to do, and he is doing them with the methodical patience of a man who understands that patience is the one resource the Soviet Union has that Finland does not. On February 1, 1940, the bombardment begins. Finnish artillery observers in forward positions on the Mannerheim line watch Soviet shells arrive at a rate of 300,000 per day. The sound of 300,000 artillery shells in a single day is not a sound that can be described in terms that have any civilian reference point. The ground shakes continuously. Concrete cracks, underground shelters fill with concussion. Men go deaf in both ears. Men lose the capacity to speak. Finnish soldiers in the Mannerheim line bunkers are not breaking. They are still at their posts, still holding, still the same men who have been holding since November. But they are being subjected to a weight of fire that is not a military problem to be solved. It is a physical process, like water wearing down stone, and the stone has limits. Mannerheim knows the limits. He has been counting toward them since the first day of the war. On February 11th, 21 Soviet divisions attack on a narrow front. The Mannerheim line, which has held since November 30th, holds for 11 more days under Timoshenko's bombardment and then breaks. Finnish positions are destroyed. Gaps are torn in the defensive belt. Soviet infantry moves through those gaps in the waves that Timoshenko has drilled them to form, following the creeping barrage, replacing losses with the next wave before the previous wave has fully stopped. Finnish units in the breakthrough zones fight with the specific ferocity of men who understand they are the last line, that there is nothing organized behind them, that the road to Helsinki runs through whatever ground they are standing on. They slow the advance, they do not stop it. On February 15th, Finnish forces on the isthmus withdraw from the first line of Mannerheim defenses to the second, and from the second to the third, and the third line is the last line. and beyond the third line is Viipuri, and beyond Viipuri is the road to Helsinki. Mannerheim goes to the Finnish government. He is precise. He is not emotional. He says what the military situation is, which is that he cannot hold much longer without reinforcement that does not exist and will not arrive in time. And he says what the consequence of continuing to resist past the point of organized defense will be, which is the loss of Finland's capacity to negotiate any terms at all. The Finnish government has been hoping, has been sustained through 2.5 months of this war by the hope that Allied intervention will arrive, that British and French forces will push through Scandinavia, that the pressure on the Soviet Union from the world's reaction to the Winter War will eventually produce a Soviet offer more favorable than the October demands. None of this happens in time. The Allied expeditionary force, genuinely promised by early March, will not arrive before Viipuri falls. The world is watching, and the world is horrified, and the world is doing nothing that changes the military equation on the Karelian Isthmus. Finnish President Risto Ryti and Foreign Minister Väinö Tanner begin the process of making contact with Moscow. The Soviets respond. The terms Molotov presents in the negotiations of late February and early March 1940 are harder than the terms Paasikivi brought back from Moscow in October 1939. Harder because Finland chose to fight rather than concede, and the Soviet Union has been bled for 100 days, and the terms now reflect not just Soviet strategic requirements but Soviet anger. The Karelian Isthmus, including Viipuri, passes to the Soviet Union. The western shore of Lake Ladoga is ceded. The Hanko Peninsula is leased for 30 years. Finland loses 11% of its territory and 30% of its pre-war economic capacity. The 430,000 Finns who live in the ceded territories, who have farmed that land for generations, whose grandparents are buried in its churchyards, whose children are in its schools, are given 12 days to leave. They leave with what they can carry. The Finnish government packs what it can of the records and the artifacts and the contents of public buildings and private homes into trucks and moves them west across a new border into a Finland that is smaller than it was in November. Every Finn in the ceded territories crosses. Not one stays under Soviet rule by choice. The evacuation is total and it is desperate, and it is accomplished in 12 days in March in the cold. The Moscow Peace Treaty is signed on March 12, 1940. At 11 o'clock on the morning of March 13th, it comes into force. The guns stop. The Winter War is over. 105 days after the Soviet Union crossed the Finnish border with the expectation of being in Helsinki within 12 of them. The accounting is brutal in both directions. The Soviet Union, by the scholarly consensus drawn from post-Soviet archive access, loses approximately 126,000 soldiers killed in action, 320,000 wounded, approximately 5,600 tanks destroyed or abandoned, approximately 900 aircraft lost. These are the numbers for a campaign projected to cost a fraction of that, against a force that Soviet generals laughed at in conference rooms before it began. Finland loses approximately 25,000 killed and 43,000 wounded, catastrophic in a nation of 3.7 million, a generation's worth of fathers and sons. But Finland survives. Finland remains a sovereign nation. Finland is not absorbed. Finland is not made a Soviet republic. The price it pays for this survival is enormous and real and written in the names on the war memorials in every Finnish town and village. But Finland pays it and is still Finland when the war is over. The consequences that echo forward from the Winter War are not confined to Finland or the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler, watching from Berlin, has drawn his conclusion about Soviet military capacity and is already moving toward the decision that will become Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. His conclusion that the Red Army is permanently crippled by the purges and can be defeated in a single campaign is wrong. But it is not obviously wrong in March 1940, when the evidence of the Winter War appears to support it. The Red Army that stumbles into Finland in November 1939 is genuinely not a competent military organization. But it is learning, and what it is learning in Finland it will apply in ways that Hitler does not anticipate and cannot afford to discount. The catastrophe of the Winter War, the frozen columns on the Rata Road, the encircled divisions in the Karelian forests, the failure to break the Mannerheim line in the first assault, forces a reorganization of Soviet command, doctrine, logistics, and winter warfare training that the Red Army carries forward. Timoshenko, who breaks the line in February, becomes People's Commissar of Defense. The men who survive the Finnish forests carry in them a knowledge of failure that is also a knowledge of what failure teaches, and armies that have learned from failure in the way the Red Army learns from Finland are more dangerous, eventually, than armies that have never been tested. The Winter War is over. Finland is alive. Paasikivi, the white-haired banker who sat across from Molotov in October and knew what the document meant, serves his country in the years that follow as a diplomat, and eventually, after the next war and its own accommodations, as President of Finland. He is remembered as the architect of a foreign policy that accepts the reality of proximity to the Soviet Union without pretending that proximity is comfortable, and that navigates it with a cold-eyed realism that keeps Finland independent through 4 more decades of the Cold War. His name is attached to a doctrine, the Paasikivi doctrine. It means understand clearly what you are living next to, do not lie to yourself about it, and find the terms on which you can survive. The generals who laughed in Moscow are mostly gone by then, the ones who were shot, the ones who were purged, the ones who died in the forests of Finland commanding divisions that the forest destroyed. They are not laughing. The ones who survived are rebuilding an army out of the wreckage of what Finland did to it, and that rebuilding in the years ahead costs tens of millions of lives. Finland held for 105 days. Finland paid the price that holding for 105 days cost. And Finland was still Finland on the morning of March 13th, 1940, when the guns went quiet and the snow lay deep on ground that had absorbed more than it should have been asked to absorb, and the men who were still alive on both sides of the new border stood in the silence and breathed the cold air and were, for a moment, simply alive. If this story hit you, like and subscribe. We find these forgotten stories every single day. The question that still divides historians is this: if Finland had accepted the October 1939 demands and given Stalin the Hanko base and the Isthmus territory without a fight, would the Winter War have prevented a worse outcome? Or would accommodation simply have made the next Soviet demand easier to make and harder to refuse? Paasikivi himself believed, in the decades after the war, that the refusal was correct. But he also believed that what saved Finland was not the fighting. It was knowing when to stop. Now, watch this next video. Next.